The Kraang had torn holes in the fabric of reality before. It was practically a Tuesday for them. Their dimensionally destabilizing technology had punched through quantum barriers, shredded the membranes between worlds, and dragged alien biology across the cosmos with the casual indifference of fishermen casting nets into an ocean they didn't own. But even by their standards, what the dimensional portal above the East River produced on a rain-soaked Wednesday night was something none of their collective hive mind had anticipated. The rift crackled open like a wound in the sky, violet and gold and screaming with energy that had no business existing in this particular slice of reality, and through it came something ancient, something that roared. The ThunderTank hit the Brooklyn Bridge's upper roadway doing what Panthro estimated was approximately 200 miles per hour, which was a generous understatement. The vehicle, all snarling Thunderian steel and feline design philosophy, tore through the guardrail, became briefly airborne over the East River, and landed on the Manhattan side of the bridge with an impact that registered on 3 different seismic monitoring stations and caused 17 car alarms to activate simultaneously in Dumbo. Panthro had the vehicle under control within 4 seconds. He counted, old habit. "Everyone alive," he growled, his massive hands already running diagnostics across the ThunderTank's instrument panel, his cybernetic arms absorbing the feedback shuddering through the controls. "Define alive," Tygra said from the gunner's position, his voice carrying the precise aristocratic irritation of a man who had just been thrown across a dimensional rift and was deeply unimpressed by the experience. In the back compartment, WilyKit and WilyKat were already pressed against the viewport, their enormous eyes reflecting the alien geometry of Manhattan's skyline, with an expression that hovered somewhere between terror and absolute wonder. Snarf was making the sound he always made when catastrophe was imminent, which was a high-pitched keening that Leonardo had learned, over years of painful experience, to take very seriously. Leonardo stood through the ThunderTank's upper hatch, the Sword of Omens already in his hand, the Eye of Thundera burning with a cold blue light that cut through the rain like a signal flare. He turned slowly, taking in the towers of steel and glass, the rivers of artificial light, the sheer vertical ambition of a city built by creatures who had apparently decided that the sky was a reasonable place to put their civilization. His jaw was set. His eyes were calculating. He had learned, after everything Third Earth had thrown at him, that the first 30 seconds in an unknown environment were the most critical. Identify threats, identify allies, identify exits, in that order. He had managed to identify approximately 0 of those 3 things when the manhole cover 12 feet to his left exploded upward, and 4 figures in colored masks landed in a combat semicircle around the ThunderTank, with the practiced efficiency of people who had done exactly this kind of thing many, many times before. "Nobody move," the one in the red mask shouted, a pair of sai already spinning in his hands with aggressive competence. Leonardo looked at him, then at the blue one, who had 2 katana drawn and crossed in a guard position that spoke of genuine training, then at the purple one, who was holding a bow staff and appeared to be muttering what sounded like a statistical probability assessment under his breath, then at the orange one, who was swinging nunchucks with an enthusiasm that suggested he was significantly more excited about this confrontation than his brothers were. They were turtles. Large, bipedal, green, and apparently ninjas, which was an occupational combination that Third Earth had not prepared him for. But Leonardo had faced the ancient spirits of evil incarnated in a rotting mummy sorcerer, so his threshold for surprise was calibrated unusually high. "We're not a threat," Leonardo said carefully, keeping the Sword of Omens visible but angled down. "We came through that." He gestured toward the fatting rift above the East River, which was still shedding violet sparks into the rain. "Yeah, we saw," the red one, Raphael, though Leonardo didn't know that yet, said. "That's kind of the problem. Things that come through dimensional portals in this city are usually Kraang, and Kraang are usually a problem. So," he let the implication hang in the rain-soaked air, "What's a Kraang?" Panthro asked, climbing out of the ThunderTank with the unhurried physicality of a man who had never once in his life felt the need to rush toward a confrontation, because confrontations had a reliable habit of coming to him. The four turtles exchanged a look. It was the specific look of people who had explained the Kraang to skeptical newcomers before and found the experience consistently exhausting. "Okay," the blue one said, Leonardo. However, that introduction was still 30 seconds away, and he lowered his katana by approximately 10 degrees, not sheathing it but at least a grammatical step toward conversation. "Maybe we should start over. You're clearly not Kraang. You're also clearly not from here." He paused, studying Lion-O with the analytical attention of someone trained to read opponents. "That sword, that energy, where did you come from?" "Third Earth," Lion-O said. Another look was exchanged between the four turtles. "Of course," Donatello said and pulled out his T-phone, already typing. "Of course there's a third Earth. Why wouldn't there be a third Earth?" If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The introductions that followed were conducted in the rain on a Manhattan street at 2 in the morning, which was, Leonardo reflected, not the strangest context in which he'd ever met potential allies. WilyKit and WilyKat had immediately and aggressively befriended Michelangelo, which required no explanation because Michelangelo befriended everyone within 90 seconds on a biological imperative basis. Snarf was regarded by the turtles with the careful diplomatic neutrality one extends to a creature whose social role you don't yet understand. Panthro and Raphael had engaged in the specific kind of silent physical assessment that large, combat-experienced individuals conduct when they meet each other, each cataloging the other's build, posture, and the particular quality of stillness that separates trained fighters from merely large ones. Tygra had immediately begun examining the ThunderTank's exposed porting systems with the focused attention of an engineer in a foreign country who has just encountered an interesting bridge. And Lion-O and Leonardo stood apart from all of it, because leaders always do, separated from the introductory chaos by the invisible weight of responsibility. "The rift you came through," Leonardo said, watching the last violet sparks die above the river. "I've seen the Kraang open portals like that. Not exactly like that, yours had a different energy, but the signature is similar enough to worry me." "The Eye of Thundera reacted to something," Lion-O said. "We were on Third Earth. We had just driven the mutants back from the Valley of the Snarfs. Then the sky opened, and the ThunderTank went through it before any of us could stop it." He looked at Leonardo directly. "I don't know if this was an accident or if something pulled us here deliberately." Leonardo absorbed this with the composure of someone who had learned that the universe rarely did anything by accident when the Kraang were involved. "How powerful is that sword?" "It can do things I'm still learning," Lion-O said honestly, which was the answer of a leader secure enough not to exaggerate. Leonardo nodded slowly. Down the street, Michelangelo was attempting to teach WilyKat a handshake of Baroque complexity, and WilyKat was matching him step for step with the competitive instinct of a Thunderian who refused to be outdone at anything. Raphael and Panthro had apparently reached some kind of unspoken accord, and were now examining the ThunderTank's cannon assembly with the shared appreciation of individuals who deeply respected functional heavy weaponry. It almost looked peaceful. Then Donatello's T-phone screamed 3 short pulses, the Kraang alert signal, and every warrior on that street was moving before the echo died, because some things translate perfectly across the boundaries between worlds, and the sound of incoming danger is one of them. "Company," Leonardo said, his katana coming up. Lion-O raised the Sword of Omens. The Eye of Thundera blazed. "Thunder," Lion-O said quietly, with the particular tone of a man reminding himself what he fights for. The first wave of Kraang droids rounded the corner and opened fire. The Kraang droids moved in a formation that suggested tactical intelligence without actually possessing it, a distinction that Donatello had spent considerable academic energy articulating to his brothers, who had responded with the universal reply of people who are being shot at, which is that the philosophical nuance of their attackers' cognition was substantially less relevant than the immediate physical fact of the laser fire. 14 droids, pink brain creatures pulsing in their robotic chest cavities, advancing down the rain-slicked street in 2 overlapping kill lines that covered angles with mechanical efficiency. Their weapons discharged in rhythmic pulses of searing pink energy that left scorch marks on asphalt and smelled like ozone and something else, something older, something that made the Eye of Thundera flicker with agitated recognition. Leonardo didn't wait to understand it. He vaulted the ThunderTank's hull in a single motion that covered 8 feet of vertical and 12 of horizontal, landed in a forward roll that absorbed the momentum, and converted it to a rising strike. And the Sword of Omens discharged a blade of pure Thunderian energy that took the lead droid across its midsection and separated it from operational status with a shriek of shearing metal. The eye burned brilliant blue in the rain. The remaining droids recalibrated their targeting toward the new variable. That was their mistake. Because while 14 Kraang droids were recalibrating their targeting toward Leonardo, Raphael came off the fire escape above them like gravity had finally lost patience with restraint. Both sides drove through the cranial housing of the nearest droid with percussive efficiency, and Raphael used the collapsing machine as a stepping stone to reach the next one. Because in close combat, Raphael's philosophy was essentially that distance was a problem you solved by eliminating it. Leonardo moved opposite him, mirror discipline to Raphael's controlled fury, his katana finding the joint seams in droid armor that Donatello had mapped in 14 months of furious note-taking. Clean, economical, surgical. Every cut was placed exactly where it needed to be and nowhere else. Michelangelo was somewhere in the chaos being Michelangelo, which meant he was somehow simultaneously in 3 places, laughing at something, and had already disabled 4 droids through a combination of nunchuck work and improvisational environmental weaponry that included a dumpster lid, a fire hydrant cap, and what appeared to be someone's abandoned bicycle. Cheetara moved through the Kraang formation like light through a prism, present everywhere, tangible nowhere. Her speed on Third Earth was already extraordinary. In the compressed urban geography of a Manhattan street, with obstacles and angles and vertical surfaces to redirect off, it became something that the Kraang's targeting system simply could not process. She was registering in 17 different grid squares simultaneously, which was a logical impossibility that the droid's programming handled by freezing for 0.3 seconds, and 0.3 seconds against Cheetara was an eternity of consequential suffering. Her staff cracked housing and joint and optical sensors in a fluid, continuous motion that never fully resolved into individual strikes. It was one long movement that happened to disable 8 separate opponents. Panthro had not bothered with finesse. Panthro rarely did. He had pulled 2 of the droids together by their cranial assemblies with his cybernetic arms and introduced them to each other at high velocity and high frequency, until they stopped being operational concerns. He was now using one of the resulting metal frames as an improvised club against the remaining droids on his side of the street, which was effective if aesthetically uncomplicated. Tygra's whip cracked in a wide arc from the rooftop he descended during the first second of engagement, his instinct always to find height, find angle, find the position that let him see the whole board. The energy discharge from the whip interacted with the Kraang technology in a way that made 3 droids lock up simultaneously, their systems cycling through error states as foreign energy cascaded through their circuitry. He noted this with clinical interest and filed it for later examination. WilyKit and WilyKat had retreated to the ThunderTank per standing protocol. Neither of them was pleased about it, and both of them had expressed this displeasure through the specific channels available to twins who communicated in a language of shared grievance. But Snarf had the hatch, and Snarf took his responsibilities extremely seriously when Lion-O was in danger. 40 seconds, 14 droids. The street was quiet again except for the rain and the settling of hot metal. Raphael looked at the wreckage, then at the ThunderCats, then back at the wreckage. "Okay," he said, with the grudging respect of someone who had been prepared to be unimpressed and had been denied that option. "You can fight." "We've been fighting since we were children," Cheetara said simply, which wasn't boastfulness, just the biographical fact of people who had grown up in a world that treated survival as a competitive examination. It was Donatello, crouched over a disabled droid with his T-phone scanner running, who broke the moment. Hey, guys." His voice had acquired the specific quality it got when Data was telling him something he didn't want to hear. These droids weren't on a standard patrol route. They were tracking something. He looked up, and his gaze went directly to the Sword of Omens. Something with a dimensional energy signature they've been scanning for, something that came through that portal. The implications settled over both groups like the rain, cold and pervasive, and impossible to ignore. "They were looking for us," Lion-O said. "It wasn't a question." "Not just looking," Donatello said. "The data burst these droids sent back before we took them down. They were reporting a confirmed acquisition signal. Whatever came through that portal, the Kraang already knew to expect it, or they knew to watch for it." Leonardo's expression shifted into the configuration his brothers recognized as the one he wore when a situation had just become significantly more complicated than the already complicated situation he'd been managing. Which means this wasn't a random rift. Someone opened it deliberately. "Or something," Tygra said from the rooftop, dropping to street level with fluid ease. The Eye of Thundera responded to energy on the other side of the dimensional boundary. It has never done that before. Whatever the Kraang are using, it has some resonance with Thunderian technology. "Great," Raphael said. "So the giant robot alien brain people specifically wanted you here. That's great. That's a great thing that's happening." Leonardo said. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." "The portal didn't feel like an accident," Lion-O said. He was staring at the Eye of Thundera, which had dimmed from its battle brilliance to a steady, watchful glow, the specific pulse it used when it was sensing rather than warning. "On Third Earth, Mumra has sought the Eye's power for as long as I can remember. Its energy is unlike anything else in our world, if there are beings here who traffic in dimensional technology. The Kraang have been trying to terraform Earth for years," Leonardo said. "They need specific energy sources to power their larger systems, if your sword's power is compatible with their technology. They wouldn't just want to destroy it," Donatello finished, standing. "They'd want to harvest it." The rain fell. Somewhere uptown, a car alarm died. In the silence that followed, the ThunderTank's sensors emitted a soft, alert tone. Panthro checked the display, and his expression, already serious, became something heavier. "Movement," he said. "Multiple signatures, Foot Clan." He said it with the flat, informational tone of someone reading weather data, but Leonardo went immediately still in the way he did when variables were multiplying faster than plans could accommodate them. The Foot Clan and the Kraang occasionally competed, occasionally cooperated, and always complicated whatever situation the turtles were already navigating. On a night when dimensional refugees had arrived in a vehicle that apparently broadcast dimensional energy like a beacon, the Foot's arrival was either a coincidence or a catastrophe, and Leonardo's experience with coincidence was that it had a terrible attendance record in his life. "How many?" Leonardo asked. 30, Panthro said, "maybe more." Raphael cracked his knuckles with a sound like a sentence ending. "Good," he said. 14 felt like a warm-up. Cheetara looked at Lion-O. Lion-O looked at Leonardo. Something passed between them, the specific current of communication that flows between leaders who are sizing up whether the person across from them makes decisions the way good decisions get made. Leonardo gave a single nod, small and deliberate. Lion-O returned it. "ThunderCats," Leonardo said, the word carrying its old weight, not a battle cry yet, just a call to readiness. "Turtles," Leonardo said, which was not traditional as rallying cries went, but his brothers responded to it the way they always did, falling into formation with the muscle memory of years. The Foot Clan came around both corners simultaneously, because Shredder's lieutenants were nothing if not geometrically thorough, and the street became chaos again, but this time, the chaos had a different quality. Two teams, two fighting styles, two worlds of warrior tradition, finding in the compression of combat the first rough outline of something that might, given time and trust, become coordination. It was not elegant, it was not synchronized, but it worked, and in the wreckage of 30-foot soldiers and the rain still falling on a Manhattan street at 3 in the morning, WilyKat looked at Michelangelo and said, with the empirical certainty of someone who had just watched a lot of evidence accumulate, "Your people are pretty good." Michelangelo beamed like a small orange sun. "Dude," he said, "we're the best." Nobody contradicted him, which, given the company present, was its own kind of compliment. Donatello's lab had hosted unusual guests before: Metalhead, Fugitoid, a temporarily amnesiac Leatherhead who had destroyed 2 workbenches and a custom circuit board before anyone could explain what was happening. But the ThunderCats occupied the space with a particular quality of displacement that went beyond mere unfamiliarity. They were creatures of a world that ran on different principles, and the sewer laboratory felt it. The ThunderTank was too large for the tunnels, parked 3 junctions back under Panthro's extremely vocal protest about the humidity's effect on the engine seals. But the ThunderCats themselves filled Donatello's workspace with a contained energy that made his equipment register fluctuations he couldn't immediately explain. The Eye of Thundera, resting in Leonardo's gauntlet on the central work table, pulsed with slow blue light that reflected off beakers and circuit boards, and cast the whole room in a quality of illumination that had no precedent in the sewer's fluorescent vocabulary. Donatello was, professionally speaking, in the most interesting crisis of his life. "The energy signature from the eye," he said, for the 3rd time, because the data kept refusing to resolve into something his existing frameworks could comfortably contain, "is not technological, it's not biological, it's not any of the 17 energy classifications I've cataloged from Kraang technology, foot mysticism, or any of the other 17 categories of impossible things I've developed taxonomies for." He looked at Tygra with the expression of a scientist who has been handed a result that breaks his methodology. "What is it?" "We call it Thunderian energy," Tygra said, examining Donatello's scanning equipment with the analytical appreciation of one engineer for another's work, even across the considerable gulf of their respective technological traditions. "It originates from Thundera, our home world, before it was destroyed. The Eye of Thundera is the last concentrated source. It is simultaneously a power reservoir, a detection instrument, and something our oldest texts describe as a living thing. Not alive in the biological sense, but aware." Donatello wrote this down, then stared at what he'd written, then wrote 3 follow-up questions and circled them with increasing urgency. Across the lab, Leonardo sat with Leonardo at the secondary workbench, a hand-drawn map of Manhattan between them, Leonardo's, rendered from memory with the precise geographical confidence of someone who had navigated these streets in 3 dimensions for years. They had been talking for 40 minutes in the low, careful register of leaders conducting an honest strategic assessment, which is a different conversation from the kind leaders have in front of their teams. "The Kraang don't open dimensional rifts accidentally," Leonardo said. "Every incursion we've dealt with has been purposeful, calculated. They think in terms of resources and objectives, not curiosity." He tapped the map where the East River Rift had appeared. "They pulled you through because they wanted something you have." Donatello's scan confirmed the droids were tracking the Eye's signature specifically, which means somewhere in the Kraang network there's a record of Thunderian energy. They knew what to look for before you arrived. Leonardo absorbed this with the stillness of someone accustomed to receiving information that recontextualized everything. On Third Earth, Mumra sought the Eye's power to amplify his own magic. He was never able to access it directly. Thunderian energy resists corruption. It cannot be used for dark purposes without, he paused, without a willing wielder. So they can't just take it. They would need to either control me or find a way to separate the sword from its bond. Leonardo's hand rested on the Sword of Omens with the unconscious protectiveness of long habit. The bond between a lord of the ThunderCats and the Eye is not mechanical. It cannot be broken by force alone. Leonardo was quiet for a moment, running calculations behind his eyes that he didn't yet have enough information to complete. What could someone do with it, if they found a way? The Eye sees truth in all things, Leonardo said. It can pierce deception, detect threats across great distances, and navigate between worlds. In the wrong application, he looked at the pulsing gem. It could be used to locate dimensional weaknesses, to map the barriers between realities, to find the thinnest points and tear through them. Leonardo set down his pencil with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a response. The Kraang have been trying to establish a permanent dimensional bridge between their home dimension and Earth for years, a stable, mappable pathway instead of the temporary rifts they currently use. He looked at Leonardo directly. If the Eye could help them find those thin points, they wouldn't need to tear holes anymore, Leonardo said. They could walk through. The lab was quiet for a moment except for Donatello's muttering and the distant sound of Michelangelo introducing WilyKit and WilyKat to the concept of pizza, which was generating reactions of euphoric disbelief that suggested Third Earth had been missing something fundamental. It was Raphael who interrupted the strategic silence, appearing in the doorway with the specific posture he adopted when he'd been listening to something that bothered him and had reached the limit of his patience with not saying so. "So let me get this straight," he said. "The Kraang pulled these guys through a dimensional rift specifically to get their hands on a magic sword that could help them open a permanent door between dimensions." He looked at Leonardo, and the only reason they haven't done it yet is that the sword won't work for evil without your permission. Essentially, Leonardo said. And somewhere out there, there's a Kraang facility that's been building toward this specific plan, which means they have infrastructure, resources, and a timeline. Raphael crossed his arms. Which also means Shredder probably knows about it, because Shredder knows about everything the Kraang do eventually, because he made a deal with them that he's been trying to either exploit or escape from since before we knew any of them existed. Leonardo looked at his brother. "You've been thinking about this since the fight." "I've been thinking about this since Donnie said the droid sent a confirmation signal," Raphael said. "Which means right now, somewhere in this city, a Kraang command node received a message that said the Eye of Thundera is present and confirmed, and whoever's running that node is making plans." He paused. "We have maybe hours before those plans become our problem in a very physical way." It was the kind of tactical clarity that Raphael produced when urgency burned through his usual combative noise, and his brothers recognized it and took it seriously. Leonardo looked at the map. "Donatello," he said. "Already on it," Donatello said, not looking up from his scanner. "I've been cross-referencing the droid's transmission frequency with the Kraang signal database I compiled after the invasion. If I can identify which node received the confirmation, his equipment emitted a sound of resolution. There." He turned the monitor so the room could see it. "Coordinates, Industrial District. Warehouse that's been on our watch list for 3 months. Activity patterns consistent with a staging facility, but we could never confirm what they were staging for." He looked at the display with the expression of a scientist whose hypothesis has just been catastrophically confirmed. "Now we know." "That's where we need to go," Leonardo said, already standing. "That's where they want us to go," Tygra said quietly from across the room, and every head turned toward him. He had not looked up from Donatello's secondary display, which he had been studying with the focused patience of someone waiting for a pattern to declare itself. The confirmation signal the droid sent, it was not simply a location report. I've been watching the frequency modulation, and the encoding structure is more complex than a standard tactical update. He finally looked up, and his golden eyes held the specific quality of someone who has found the thing he was looking for and wishes he hadn't. It was an invitation. The Kraang sent those droids, knowing we would defeat them. The signal was designed to be found. The coordinates Donatello located are exactly where they want us, Leonardo finished. The silence that followed had texture and weight. Doesn't matter, Panthro said, from the doorway where he'd appeared at some point during Tygra's analysis, because Panthro always found his way to the room where tactical decisions were being made. Whether it's a trap or not, we still have to go. They have the location of something they need. We have to get there first or make sure they can't use what they find. He looked around the room with the calm authority of someone who had been in enough impossible situations to have stopped distinguishing between them and merely difficult ones. The question isn't whether we walk into it. The question is how we walk into it. Lion-O looked at Leonardo. Leonardo looked at Lion-O around them. 8 warriors from 2 worlds processed the same arithmetic and arrived at the same conclusion through 8 different routes that nonetheless terminated at an identical coordinate. Together, Lion-O said. Leonardo nodded once. Together. Michelangelo's voice drifted in from the common room, bright and completely unclouded by the strategic gravity of everything that had just been discussed. Guys, WilyKit just ate 6 slices, and she's going for 7. I think she might actually be the greatest person I've ever met. Nobody laughed, but several people came close, which in the middle of everything was its own small, necessary victory. The Kraang staging facility occupied a converted meatpacking warehouse in the industrial district, with the aggressive architectural anonymity of a building that very much wanted you to look at something else. No windows at street level. Reinforced loading doors with electromagnetic seals that Donatello had cataloged as third-generation Kraang hardening technology, a significant upgrade from the facilities they'd raided 18 months ago, which meant whoever was running this operation had access to newer supply chains and more time than the Turtles had given them. Thermal imaging from the rooftop showed 43 distinct heat signatures inside, a number that Raphael received with satisfaction and Leonardo received with the careful neutrality of someone doing arithmetic about odds. The ThunderTank was staged 4 blocks south under Panthro's supervision, engines cold, weapons hot, ready to move on signal. The plan was infiltration first, intelligence second, extraction of whatever the Kraang were building toward third, and then the ThunderTank's cannon array as punctuation if everything else went wrong. Plans, in Leonardo's experience, were optimistic literature. They were through the rooftop access and 30 feet into the facility's upper gantry before the first indication that tonight was not going to honor the plan's core assumptions. The interior of the warehouse had been restructured, walls removed, floor space reconfigured around a central apparatus of Kraang technology that bore no resemblance to anything in Donatello's extensive catalog of their machinery. It was enormous. It occupied the full center of the space, rising 3 stories to the roof beams, a lattice of crystalline conduit and pulsing pink energy that hummed at a frequency Lion-O felt in his back teeth and recognized with a cold certainty in the part of him that had carried the Eye of Thundera long enough to develop instincts about power. That's a dimensional anchor, Tygra said, very quietly, crouched on the gantry beside Lion-O with his eyes moving across the apparatus with the focused attention of someone reading a language he only partially speaks. The principle is different from Thunderian technology, but the purpose is identical. It's designed to fix a dimensional pathway in place, to make it permanent and stable. He paused. It's almost complete. How almost? Leonardo asked. It needs a power source to initialize the anchor matrix, Tygra said. something with sufficient dimensional energy to prime the system and lock the pathway coordinates. His eyes moved to the Eye of Thundera with the reluctant certainty of a conclusion he'd been hoping to avoid. Something exactly like the Eye. Below them, among the Kraang droids moving in maintenance patterns around the apparatus, 3 figures stood in conference that had nothing to do with the hive mind's usual communal processing. 2 of them were Kraang, but larger, differently configured, bearing the kind of structural modifications that indicated hierarchy rather than function. Command units. The 3rd figure was human-shaped, armored, and stood with a quality of physical authority that Leonardo recognized before his brain consciously processed the silhouette. His grip tightened on his katana. Shredder. He stood in his full armor, bladed pauldrons catching the pink light of the Kraang apparatus, and he was not posturing or threatening, or doing any of the theatrical things he did when he wanted an audience to understand his power. He was listening, taking in information with the focused pragmatism of a man conducting a transaction he intended to control. Whatever arrangement the Foot and the Kraang had constructed between them over the years of uneasy parallel operation, tonight it had apparently resolved into something operational. "The energy source will arrive," one of the command Kraang was saying, its translated voice carrying the flat synthetic quality of language processed through alien cognition. "The Kraang have arranged its delivery. The vessel that carries the Eye of Thundera will be drawn to this location through the confirmation signal. The wielder cannot be controlled, but the wielder can be separated from the sword through sufficient application of force combined with." "You told me this facility was secure," Shredder said. His voice was the same as Leonardo remembered, deep, precise, entirely without unnecessary inflection. A voice that had been trained to communicate absolute certainty. "You told me the ThunderCat arrival was anticipated and contained within your operational parameters." The Kraang confirmed this. "Then why?" Shredder said, and turned slowly to look directly up at the gantry where 8 warriors were crouched in what they had believed was shadow. "Are they already here?" The facility exploded into motion. Leonardo made the call in the half-second before the first droid raised its weapon. Split teams, turtles drawing droid fire, ThunderCats moving on the apparatus. Nobody engaging Shredder directly yet, because Shredder alone in an open space against divided attention was a catastrophic variable they couldn't absorb right now. He transmitted it in the compressed signal language he and his brothers had developed over the years. 3 short gestures that contained the full tactical picture, and his brothers moved before the transmission finished, because that was what years of training in a confined underground space produced. Raphael dropped from the gantry onto a cluster of droids with the percussive enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for permission to stop being quiet. Leonardo went the opposite direction, drawing fire and attention from the command Kraang, while Cheetara's speed translated from the gantry to the facility floor in a single continuous motion that covered 60 feet in a time that made Donatello's instruments question their calibration. Michelangelo and WilyKat hit the droid formation's eastern flank in a combination that was chaotic in appearance and devastatingly effective in result, because WilyKat's Thunderian gymnastic combat and Michelangelo's improvisational nunchuck work occupied completely different spatial registers, and addressing both simultaneously required a droid to be in 2 places at once, which they were not. Leonardo went for the apparatus. He knew before he took his first step toward it that he was doing exactly what the Kraang had designed this situation to produce, bringing the Eye of Thundera into proximity with the dimensional anchor. But the alternative was leaving the device operational and intact, and a completed dimensional anchor with Kraang and Shredder controlling the pathway was not a condition he was willing to allow. He raised the Sword of Omens, calling on the Eye not for combat but for analysis, sight beyond sight, the old invocation, the one Jaga had taught him when he was young and arrogant and impatient to understand everything at once. The eyes showed him the apparatus in truth. It was more complete than Tygra had estimated. The anchor matrix was 90% initialized. Someone had been feeding it dimensional energy for weeks, not from a single concentrated source, but from dozens of small samples harvested from the rifts the Kraang had been opening across the city for months. Every portal, every breach, every dimensional incursion had left a residue, and the Kraang had been collecting it with the patient accumulation of beings who thought in longer timescales than their opponents. They didn't need the eye to complete the anchor. They needed it to stabilize what the anchor revealed, to use its truth-seeing properties as a navigation instrument, to find the precise dimensional coordinates of the Kraang home dimension, and lock the pathway so it could never be disrupted or closed. Leonardo lowered the sword. The apparatus could be destroyed. It was not yet permanent, not yet anchored, and a sufficient discharge from the Sword of Omens directed at the matrix conduits would cascade through the system and collapse the whole structure before the initialization completed. But a discharge that size in an enclosed space would. Shredder hit him from the left with a force that suggested the foot's master had been waiting precisely for the moment when Leonardo's attention was occupied by analysis rather than combat. The blow was not superhuman. Shredder had no powers, only training and armor, and 4 decades of violence refined into economy. But it was precisely placed and carried the full commitment of someone who had calculated the exact angle and timing. Leonardo went sideways, caught the gantry support with his free hand, and was back in his stance in 2 seconds, which was fast enough to impress Shredder, whose expression behind the mask shifted with fractional acknowledgement. "The sword," Shredder said, "not a demand, an observation about what the evening was ultimately about." "You can't use it," Leonardo said. "It won't respond to you." "I don't need to use it," Shredder said, advancing with the measured pace of a fighter who has identified his opponent's recovery time and is calibrating his attack rhythm accordingly. "I need to deliver it. What the Kraang do with it after that is their concern. My concern is what they've promised me in exchange." He struck, a combination of blade and closed fist technique that spoke of styles Leonardo didn't recognize, fast and sequential, and designed to overwhelm a defender's ability to track multiple attack lines simultaneously. Leonardo met it. Not cleanly. Shredder was the most technically refined opponent he had faced since leaving Third Earth, and the armor's blades added dimensions to the engagement that required constant spatial accounting. But he met it, and held and pushed back, and the Sword of Omens moved between defense and counterstrike with the fluid responsiveness of a weapon that was also, in some sense, a partner. Around them, the warehouse was full of fire and impact, and the specific orchestral chaos of 8 warriors fighting 40 droids, while a 9-story dimensional apparatus hummed toward completion above them all. Donatello's voice came through the communicator Leonardo had given Leonardo before entry, urgent, precise, carrying the specific frequency of a scientist who has just finished a calculation he desperately wanted to be wrong. "The anchor matrix is accelerating. Something in the fight, the energy discharges, the eye's use of sight beyond sight, it's feeding the initialization. Every time the eye activates in this proximity, it's contributing to the completion sequence." A pause. "Leonardo, you can't use the sword again. Every time you do, you're finishing what they built this to do." Leonardo absorbed this information while blocking a blade strike from Shredder that would have taken his arm at the elbow if it had connected. The sword that protected him was also the weapon destroying them. He had faced impossible choices on Third Earth. He had learned, painfully and repeatedly, that the universe did not offer clean solutions to problems constructed from genuine dilemmas. But this was a new geometry of impossible, and he had perhaps 4 seconds before Shredder's next combination, and no time at all to think through everything the answer required. He thought through it anyway. That was what it meant to be Lord of the ThunderCats, not to have the right answer, to find it fast enough to matter. Leonardo made his decision in the space between one breath and the next, which was where all decisions of genuine consequence actually lived, not in the long deliberations or the strategic councils or the careful mapping of variables, but in the compressed instant when everything you are resolves into a single direction. He sheathed the sword of omens. Not defensively, not tactically, completely. The Eye of Thundera went dark the moment the blade seated in its scabbard, and the dimensional anchor above them stuttered, its initialization sequence hiccuping on the sudden absence of the energy source it had been passively drawing from, the way a fire stutters when you remove the wood it didn't know it was consuming. The hum that had been climbing toward completion dropped 3 registers and began cycling uncertainly, conduits flickering between pink and nothing, the matrix struggling to maintain coherence without the passive contribution of Thunderian energy feeding its framework. Shredder stopped. It was the most dangerous thing he could have done, because Shredder stopping meant Shredder recalculating, and Shredder recalculating meant the most tactically sophisticated mind in the room was now fully focused on the new variable that Leonardo's choice had introduced. His bladed silhouette was perfectly still in the flickering light of the destabilizing apparatus, and behind the mask, his eyes were moving across the situation with the speed of a man who had survived 40 years of conflict by never being slower than the problem. "Interesting," Shredder said. "One word. The tone of a chess player watching an opponent sacrifice a queen." "Without the eye active, your anchor can't complete," Leonardo said. He was breathing carefully, monitoring Shredder's stance for the microshifts that telegraphed intent, keeping the sheathed sword accessible but making no move toward it. "And I won't activate it, which means your arrangement with the Kraang just became significantly less valuable." "My arrangement with the Kraang," Shredder said, "was never about the anchor." The admission landed in the room's chaos like a stone into still water, and Leonardo, fighting through a cluster of droids 30 feet away, heard it and felt something cold move through his tactical picture. He broke from his engagement with a spinning kick that cleared space, his attention splitting between the droids reconfiguring around him and the conversation happening at the apparatus that had just reframed everything. "Then what?" Leonardo said. Shredder moved, not toward Leonardo but sideways, positioning the way fighters move when they're creating geometry rather than distance. "The Kraang promised me a dimensional pathway, not to their home dimension, to a specific location, a prison." He let the word settle. "There is something imprisoned in a dimensional fold adjacent to this reality that I have been trying to reach for 3 years. The Kraang know how to open the door. What they needed from your sword was the navigation instrument, the sight beyond sight." His head tilted fractionally. "I don't actually care about their invasion. I care about what's behind that door." "What's behind it?" Leonardo asked. "Nothing that concerns you," Shredder said and attacked. But Leonardo had been listening to the answer underneath the answer, the way Jaga had taught him, not what is said but what the saying reveals. And what Shredder's words revealed was that he was operating on a timeline that the Kraang's failure tonight had just disrupted, which meant he was angry beneath the discipline, and angry opponents make choices that technically superior ones don't. Leonardo read the attack's geometry in the first tenth of a second and stepped inside it, taking Shredder's blade arm at the wrist with both hands and redirecting the momentum rather than opposing it, a technique that Panthro had drilled into him on Third Earth for 6 months, and that Shredder clearly had not anticipated from someone he'd categorized as a sword fighter. They went to the ground together, Shredder's technical precision meeting Leonardo's raw strength at close range, where neither advantage was clean, and for 4 seconds, the most dangerous man in New York and the Lord of the ThunderCats were a single struggling mass of contested physics on the warehouse floor. What resolved it was not a technique. It was Leonardo, who had crossed the warehouse floor in the time the grapple consumed and placed both katana at the precise angles that made continuing the grapple a geometrically terminal proposition for Shredder, regardless of outcome. The blades didn't touch him. They didn't need to. Shredder understood angles. He went still. "It's done," Leonardo said. His voice was the specific flat calm of someone who has wanted this moment for years and finds it, now that it's here, simply necessary rather than satisfying. "The Kraang are finished, Donnie. Status. Anchor matrix is at 30% and dropping." Donatello's voice came through the communicator, taut with focus. "Without the eye feeding it, the initialization is reversed. If it drops below 20%, it'll cascade and the whole structure comes down. We have maybe 8 minutes before this building becomes a very enthusiastic pile of expensive alien rubble." "Panthro," Leonardo said, not loudly, but the communicator carried it. "Already moving," Panthro's voice came back, and in the distance the ThunderTank's engines answered with a sound like geological displeasure. The next 4 minutes were the organized chaos of extraction. Foot soldiers who had been holding perimeter outside the building, making contact with Raphael and Cheetara, in a brief, decisive engagement that ended when Cheetara covered the distance between herself and the Foot's formation in under 2 seconds, and Raphael hit the resulting confusion from the flank, with the cheerful destructive energy of someone who had been waiting all evening for exactly this. WilyKit and WilyKat moved through the warehouse's upper gantry, disabling the Kraang droids that Michelangelo had herded upward with a combination of improvised explosives and the particular talent he had for making opponents chase him into positions he'd already chosen for them. Leonardo kept Shredder contained with the specific quality of attention you give to a caged animal, complete, because anything less is how you get hurt. It was Tygra who found the door. Not the dimensional anchor, not the apparatus. A physical door, set into the warehouse's north wall beneath a concealing rack of Kraang equipment, was unremarkable in every respect except that it was sealed with a locking mechanism that was neither Kraang nor Foot in design. It was old. Older than either, older than the facility, older possibly than anything that had any business being in an industrial warehouse in Manhattan. He recognized the material of the seal, the way you recognize something from a dream. Not with certainty, but with the unsettling conviction that your brain has connected two things it should not logically have connected. "Lion-O," he said quietly. Lion-O crossed to him, looked at the door, looked at the seal. The Eye of Thundera still sheathed, pulsed once through the scabbard, uninvoked, involuntary recognition. "This is Thunderian," Lion-O said. The words came out without the scaffolding of certainty, more like a question wearing a statement's clothes. "The material is consistent with Third Earth metallurgy," Tygra said, "pre-destruction era, before Thundera fell." He ran his fingers along the edge of the seal without touching the lock mechanism, the way you approach something you respect enough to be cautious around. "This wasn't built by the Kraang. It was here before them. They built the facility around it." "Shredder," Leonardo said, and the name carried a specific weight of implication that required no elaboration. Shredder, still contained between Leonardo's katana and the wall, said nothing, which was, in Leonardo's experience, the most informative response available to a man who had decided that silence was tactically superior to any of his other options. "What's behind this door," Lion-O said, turning to look at Shredder directly, "is connected to Third Earth." Shredder's stillness had a quality now, the stillness of a man deciding how much a secret costs compared to what silence is currently running him. He had lost the facility, lost the anchor, lost the operational timeline. What remained was leverage, and leverage requires information, and information requires a decision about what you're actually trying to accomplish beneath the layers of tactical positioning and personal vendetta, and 40 years of forward motion that never quite resolves into the peace it was supposedly generating. 3 years ago, Shredder said finally, a dimensional rift opened spontaneously above the East River, before the Kraang began engineering their portals, before any of this. He looked at Lion-O, something came through it, not a vehicle, not a person, a signal, in a language that predated every linguistic database I could access. He paused. My researchers eventually identified fragments of it as a distress call. The dimensional anchor above them groaned, the cascade beginning, the matrix dropping through 20% toward the structural failure that would bring the apparatus, and possibly the building down with it in several minutes that Donatello had specified, and everyone had been loosely tracking. The ThunderTank's cannon was audible now, outside, Panthro clearing the perimeter of the foot soldiers who'd regrouped at the building's south entrance. They had perhaps 3 minutes. "A distress call from where?" Leonardo asked. Shredder looked at the sealed door. "From whatever is on the other side of that." The building shuddered as the anchor matrix dropped through 15%. Dust fell from the roof beams. The Kraang droids that still functioned were executing whatever emergency protocol governed their behavior when a facility became structurally non-viable, which primarily seemed to involve leaving very quickly, and the warehouse was emptying of everything except the 2 groups of warriors, one imprisoned villain, one sealed ancient door, and the specific pressure of a decision that needed to be made in the time remaining. Leonardo looked at Leonardo. Leonardo looked at the door. The Eye of Thundera pulsed again through the scabbard, steady, rhythmic, the pulse it used when it was not warning but waiting, as if it knew something that Leonardo had not yet caught up to. As if it had always known this door was here, in this city, in this world, and the dimensional rift that had pulled the ThunderTank through the sky above the East River was not an accident engineered by the Kraang, but something older using the Kraang's technology as convenient infrastructure for its own purposes. Not a trap, a summons. "We open it," Leonardo said. "The building has 2 minutes," Donatello said through the communicator, and his voice had the quality of a scientist who has done the math and is reporting it accurately while personally wishing the math had come out differently. "Then we open it fast," Leonardo said, and drew the Sword of Omens for the first time since he'd sheathed it, and this time he didn't invoke the eye for combat or navigation or sight beyond sight. He invoked it for the oldest function it carried, the one Jaga had described in the oldest texts of Thunderian civilization, the function that predated every other application and gave the sword its name before it had a name. He invoked it as a key. The seal recognized it. Of course it did. The seal had been waiting in the dark behind the Kraang facility, behind 3 years of Shredder's obsessive excavation and the Kraang's unwitting custodianship, waiting for exactly this invocation from exactly this sword carried by exactly the right hands. The lock disengaged with a sound that was less mechanical than musical, a chord rather than a click, resonant and final and somehow relieved, the way a held breath sounds when it's finally released. The door opened. The light that came through it was not pink Kraang energy, or the blue of Thunderian power, or the yellow of the warehouse's failing fluorescence. It was warm and gold and ancient, and it carried on it a smell that hit Leonardo in the chest like a physical blow, ozone and crystal and something else. Something that had no name in any language except the one spoken on a planet that no longer existed. A smell that meant home in the most absolute and irretrievable sense of the word. From somewhere within the light, something stirred. And in the wreckage of the warehouse, with the dimensional anchor collapsing above them and the ThunderTank's cannon fire audible outside and Shredder watching from the wall with the expression of a man who has spent 3 years trying to reach a door that opened in 30 seconds for someone else, Leonardo stepped forward into the gold light, because that was what lords of the ThunderCats did. They stepped forward. Whatever waited on the other side of the door that had been sealed since before the Kraang found it, since before Shredder's researchers decoded the distress call, since before any of them had existed in proximity to each other, it was waiting specifically for him. The eye knew it, the sword knew it, and Leonardo, standing in the threshold between the collapsing warehouse and the warm, impossible light of something that smelled like Thundera, knew it too. Behind him, without hesitation or discussion, the turtles followed. Then the ThunderCats. Then, after a pause that contained an entire private calculation about cost and benefit, and the particular arithmetic of a man who has been pursuing something for 3 years and finds it opening in front of someone else, Shredder followed too. The door closed behind them. Above the empty warehouse, the dimensional anchor completed its cascade failure and came down in a cascade of crystalline conduit and alien metal that raised a dust cloud visible from 4 blocks away and registered on the same seismic monitoring stations that had logged the ThunderTank's landing hours earlier. Panthro, outside, watched the building settle with the professional assessment of someone cataloging structural failure, then looked at the communicator, then at the closed door that was somehow still standing in the rubble, glowing faintly gold at its seams. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things years of survival had given him, the ability to be still in the aftermath of catastrophe and trust that the people who mattered would find their way back. They always had, even from the places that seemed most like endings. The gold light behind the door pulsed once, steady and warm like a heartbeat. Somewhere beyond it, Leonardo's voice carried the old words, not a battle cry, not an invocation, but the declaration that had meant something true since the first Lord of the ThunderCats had said it, facing something vast and unknown and necessary. ThunderCats ho! And in a universe of mutant ninjas and alien invaders and ancient evil, and the daily improbable heroism of people who had no business being heroes and did it anyway, those words meant exactly what they had always meant. We go forward together into whatever comes next. The legend of the ThunderCats in the world of the Ninja Turtles had only just begun, and somewhere across the dimensional fold, in the places where Kraang hive minds processed loss and recalculated, where the Shredder's obsession had found its door finally open, where ancient Thunderian technology hummed in gold light that had no business existing in a Manhattan warehouse, and where 4 turtles and 6 cat warriors stood together facing something none of them had a word for yet. The real story was waiting, with the patience of things that have been waiting a very long time. It had chosen its moment well.